I had a friend of mine who had founded a company 25 years before that was more of a friend of the family. He actually founded a company called Environmental Design in 1977. Brilliant guy, entrepreneurial as they come, and willing to go out there and make it happen. I moved over to Environmental Design in 2006 and was with those guys until earlier this year, beginning of this year. When I was there, so these guys, what they're known for, they're the best in the world at one thing, and that thing is tree transplanting. So they've developed techniques internally and patented most of it for moving the largest trees in the world with the best success rates. And this gets done all over the world. And I was able to do a lot of that during my time there. It's a great company, fast, wonderful people, and now I am a client of theirs. And we'll go into some more. I'm going to talk to you guys about tree moving because it's the funnest thing that I get to talk about, and I miss doing it. So how did I end up here? Raise your hand if you've heard of the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon. So that's 6 degrees. It's not all that impressive if you ask me. I mean, there's folks that are more connected. This guy. I would say it's more like 2 degrees of separation to anybody in the world of horticulture. It's fascinating. Everybody knows Dave Creech. So I was lucky enough to run into him 2 years ago. It was actually 2 years ago. So 3 Wild About Woodies ago, I came out here in search of these exotic Mexico oaks that I had just been introduced to kind of by chance. So I came looking for the source, found Dave mumbling and making funny jokes, walking around sweating with a group of people kind of trailing behind, and I realized that's kind of how it goes around here. So voila, here I am. And it was very, going through this presentation, because I don't do much of this anymore in my new role, it was an introspective opportunity to just take a look back and see how the heck did I end up here, right? Talking to this group. And I don't think, Dave, I would be at Twinwood had I not come that day. I don't think there's any chance. And so I either owe you a debt of gratitude or a whole, yeah, exactly. We'll see how it goes, I guess. Okay, that's the background. So here's a little bit about Twinwood, and then I'll get right into the subject matter. Twinwood is actually 15,000 acres. So I think I'm going to do this right. No. Uh-oh. No. How do I do this? Okay. This yellow area is 15,000 acres, 40 miles or so west of Houston. I would say, almost half of it is going to be developed commercially, residential and commercial development. And about 5,000 of those acres are not going to be developed, and they're going to be in agricultural use, several different ones, and that's what we're working on. A lot of that is going to be based here. Of the 5,000 acres, about 1,000 are in use now, and we're going to be doing some different things that I've gotten involved with through SFA, one being the Golden Kiwi trial that Dave's changing the world on, it seems. These are 2 of Dave's Mexico trees that he introduced me to. We're going to be growing these for the trade and introducing new plants to the trade. We have an existing sod business already that's been around for 20 years. Nothing too exotic or sexy about that, but we have some ideas. And we've got several hundred acres of pecans that I'm just trying to learn how to get into the pecan business, which is pretty exciting, actually. Okay, so for today, what was on the list for me to talk about, and trees are my background, what to do when planting trees, picking the right tree, planting it the right way with the right technique, and finding the appropriate location. And I added this right time because that's pretty important as well, especially when you're talking about commercial projects with huge budgets and huge plant lists, hundreds or even thousands of trees. You want to get it right. And then I'll switch over and share a little bit of my experience with tree moving and one project in particular. Contract growing, what that is for those not, it's exactly what it sounds like. Rather than waiting till it's time to install the landscape of a project and saying, okay, well, we need 800 of these specific special trees. Well, you're not going to be able to find them. So recognizing that, the landscape architecture community goes out and gets people under contract to custom grow trees that'll meet their specifications, whether it's species, it's usually a unique situation. The number of trees, the size of the trees, the species, or if they're in tight planting conditions, so on and so forth. Okay, so the right tree. A lot of these photos, and I'll point this out along the way, and then at the end we'll go through just a little summary, but when I was with Environmental Design, probably the signature project in the company's history was the 9/11 Memorial Project up at 9/11 in New York City. They were contracted, I'm getting used to saying they instead of we. They were contracted to grow 500 trees for the plaza. So every tree that you see surrounding the plaza and around the fountains was procured, grown for 10 years, and then installed on site by Environmental Design, or one of their subcontractors, because it was a union job, of course. So what's important when you're considering what trees to go with? So project designers, I've spent 10 years with landscape architects who want to get the tree decisions right, but they may reside in the Bay Area in California trying to design a huge project in Fort Worth, Texas. So they don't know, they can't be experts in plants or horticulture for all parts of the world. It just doesn't work that way. And they also do a lot of work internationally. So we work with those guys to try and work on a plant palette that will work, that'll give them some degree of confidence that the installation is going to be successful. So things to consider. What do you want from a design intent? A lot of thought goes into these trees, and the same, I guess, for homeowners as well. Do you want a tree that's going to give you shade? Are you trying to pick an ornamental tree that doesn't need to grow quite as large? Do you want deciduous trees, or do you need something evergreen that's going to give you privacy year-round? Certain things like that to consider. Cold-hardiness is a big one. And my recommendation for homeowners as well as landscape architects is to stay away from the margins. If it's something that's on the edge and you have an unexpected or an uncharacteristically cold winter, big problems. Particularly then you have the expense of removing the tree, replanting, huge dollars. When you're putting in 400 trees on the 9/11 Memorial Plaza, huge problem. We were involved in selecting this species with the landscape architects during my time with Environmental Design. It's Quercus bicolor, swamp white oak. The toughest urban condition probably in the country is Manhattan. And whether it's because of the giant rats that run around beneath the walk here, the winds, the salt water, you name it. It's just the pollution. But the only thing I can tell you that doesn't occur is foot traffic, compaction on the root balls. They don't need to worry about that because the trees are planted beneath a suspended deck system. Natives, what I would recommend to anybody who's trying to figure out what they want to plant and they want to make sure that it's going to be a successful planting, look around. Just look around you and see, make sure that what you're choosing is doing well here. You guys you should be, if you don't know it, you should be spoiled from being here. Your plant palette is huge. Trees, there's so many to pick from. If you're in Dallas-Fort Worth, it probably reduces by 50 to 60% in terms of what species will work.
What determines whether a tree is native or not? How long does it have to be in an area to be considered native?
That's a good question. That's one that I'm probably not going to answer directly because I don't want to give you the wrong answer. My opinion about that, you'd have to be a historian to go figure out if it was introduced or truly native. What I mean by native is it naturally occurring? Do you see it in forests, in the surrounding areas? Obviously, we want to avoid invasive. There's an invasive list for the state of Texas, and I think it's even somewhat regionalized. But no, I'm just talking about trees that you don't want to introduce something new that you don't know what it's going to do because it looks like it has a nice bark or maybe a fall foliage. And I'll cut to the bottom here. Provenance is huge. A live oak that you plant or purchase from Houston, Texas or Dallas-Fort Worth is not the same plant as what you might get from Tampa, Florida or Orlando, Florida. Different soil conditions. The seed stocks it's different genetics. It's as different as a different species. This is important. What kind of condition are the trees going to be planted in? Is it going to be in a lawn? Is it going to be in a true urban, tough condition where there's going to be pedestrian foot traffic or vehicular or maintenance equipment running into it over and over? Some trees just are more susceptible to that than others. And of course, some trees will perform better. Some trees are just better for urban environments, and that's why when you're doing commercial projects, the list gets whittled down pretty quickly, and that's why there's so much interest in the community to get new plants added to the list to be able to use on landscapes. I'll say this though, there's a cycle, and it's hard to break. You've got designers who would love to expand the plant palette and plant new things and interesting things, but they can't put a design together that won't be installed for 2 years, hoping that these plants are available for purchase, because then you kind of look foolish. On the other hand, you've got growers who don't want to grow something that they don't know for sure is going to get purchased and used. So it's a tough thing. So what we're trying to do at Twinwood Farms is get new plants in through the architects, give them some familiarity that they're being grown in Texas for projects in Texas and the South. The right way, this is just as important, maybe more so. Delivery method is just what it sounds like. What are you buying? How is the tree going to show up? What is it physically, delivered in? And size does matter when it comes to root balls. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The one that we're all most familiar with, I think, are plastic containers, just like these. They range in size from, I think the next slide actually, no, sorry. From 1 gallon or even smaller all the way up to 300 gallons, which is quite significant. There's some positives and negatives. It's great to get a full root system when you buy a containerized plant. There's no root loss when you take it home. Then there's some other trade-offs in terms of keeping it healthy. If there's any time before you purchase the plant and stick it in the ground, they tend to dry out real fast, surprisingly so. You get used to watering things in the ground, and you put them above ground, and you find the difference pretty quickly. Girdling roots are another issue, and I've got some photographs that illustrate that pretty well. Balled and burlap, this is kind of an old technique. It's labor intensive. It's by hand. It's shovels. They carve out a root ball from a tree that's in the ground, and they wrap it in burlap, and they pin it all together, and it looks, if they do a good job, it looks nice and tight, and if they do a bad job, it looks like a diaper. So there's some trade-offs, and I'll show you some of that here shortly. A technique that I've gotten a whole lot of experience with and had results far better than balled and burlap is these machine dug and basketed trees, and I'll show you what that looks like. In fact, so this is also at the 9/11 Memorial. These trees were all selected and had to be located within 500 miles of the installation site of Ground Zero, and that was for LEED certification. So that made finding the trees particularly difficult, and I think that the trees were rejected at an 80% rate after being pre-tagged, pre-approved via photographs. So it was really tough. That was probably the hardest part of the project until we got downtown and had to start dealing with cranes and, on top of the plaza. But there's a video that I'll show you in a little while that shows this process. So a machine dug this tree out of the ground, picked it up, and it already had a hole ready. It had a basket sitting in the hole, and put the tree inside of it. So now you're lifting it and hoisting from the hoops on the basket. So there's no stress whatsoever on the root ball, which is really the most important thing. Of course, you don't want to do any damage, obviously, to the limbs or the trunk of the tree, with the mechanical damage there. So Dave, this is the same technique that we used for when we dug all the trees here at, what's the name of the property?
Science Research Center on the Wood.
You'd think I would have put some pictures in here, but I didn't think to. So those are the different delivery methods that are out there, and they all have their trade-offs, and they're all better in certain ways depending on planting conditions and the logistics. Normally a project will have some of all of them if it's a large project. Then handling becomes the big item. There's not a lot of contractors out there that are experienced or familiar or just capable of handling trees. This root ball here is relatively small in the tree transplanting world, and it's 90-inch diameter. It probably weighs 8,000 pounds, is my guess, depending on how wet it is. But you get into those sizes, and it gets real scary and unsafe real fast if you don't know how to handle and rig safely. Telehandlers, which is what this is, all a telehandler is an extended reach forklift, that you can boom out and set the trees down just in the same fashion. Cranes are used in much the same way, except obviously they're taking much larger loads and reaching out either higher or farther out. In terms of the right way to plant trees, here are the things that tend to get you in trouble and cause problems on installations. Elevation is the best way to kill a tree, setting it below grade. Dig a hole too deep, set a tree in it, and it'll likely drown before too long, or it'll get buried and smother the roots. That's the most, I'd say 75% of the trees that I see lost on projects come from planting the trees too deep. And normally that occurs because they don't compact the subgrade well enough and the trees settle over time. So we would normally recommend setting trees 4 to 6 inches high, and then they'll usually settle too. But you always want to make sure that the tree is above finished grade and not below it. Some architects won't have it, and they'll make sure you have it at grade, but anything below, we would never even warranty the tree if it was set too low. Staking and guying, I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. It's necessary. It's rarely done right, and it's probably one of the more frustrating, problematic problems with tree installations. You've all seen them, and I'll show you some pictures that'll probably look familiar. This is kind of tied in with the elevation. Poorly drained soils are a huge issue. And some of these trees that you're planting, a tree like this, forget about this project specifically, but trees in this size that would be installed on a project are $10,000 a piece in some cases. And you plant these $10,000 trees in a soil condition where you're going from a somewhat light soil mix inside of the box to, if it's a rocky or poorly draining soil, it's like a bathtub. So you're adding water, it fills up, drowns your tree. Irrigation. Trees generally will need 1 to 2 summers of supplemental water before they can get established. In some cases, some areas, they'll need more. And some trees, containerized trees are, they've never had to work to find water, so they've been babied. So they're even more sensitive to having irrigation. So always consider, what's going to be that water source if you're doing this at home. On most construction projects, there's going to be at least temporary irrigation involved, if not permanent. These are some what not to do photos, or it's just, this is really more of an industry issue. This is a machine dug tree. You can see this basket here. So this was dug with a machine and placed inside of this basket, and then they rigged to these ropes, because this is a really small, this is probably a 3-inch diameter tree, so this is probably 3 feet across. So what you're looking for here is the root flare. The top 12 to 18, maybe 24 inches of soil at the root flare is where all the magic happens. It's the oxygenated soil. It's where gas exchange occurs. It's where it takes up nutrients and water. It's everything but beneath that, for all intents and purposes, is structural. It's anchors. So you want to have that root flare exposed, and you can see on the trees outside where the flare starts. It's a nice, happy tree most of the time. Look at the depth here. Because of the way these trees were planted in this field, they use machines that kind of fluff the dirt up and it settles. So your tree ends up, this is probably 6 to 8 inches deep where they found the flare. They found, they dug down and found the root flare. So maybe it's a little more than 8 inches to where that flare actually exists. And you can't see this in the field. The architect shows up and says, I want 30 of those, and they put ribbons on each tree and say, I'll take these. This tree farm goes out and digs the trees with their equipment. What they're doing, because not only are these roots buried, you're going to have a much smaller root zone than you would have had the tree been dug at the appropriate level. And this next slide shows that. So had this tree been planted at the appropriate depth or not covered up with soil, this should have been the top of the root ball. And you would have gotten this much more root zone starting here. So you can see you've had a weak root system that's buried. So not much chance for success. If the tree lives, it's going to look stunted and unhealthy. So this is one knock against B&B or machine dug trees. It takes a lot of labor to go and figure out what they've done in the field, and you don't find out about it till you get it on the job site. This is a really bad case. This is more typical, maybe 4 inches. And what we would do when we plant these trees is we would just dig back this dirt and set it at the right height. This tree should be rejected if it's not too late for that. Any questions so far? Girdling roots. This is, if you see a tree like this, don't buy it. This root here is connected, and this is just an example. And this is at a real nursery, and I mean, I'm not sure why it was still there, but this, Dr. Creech, this was taken by David Marks. He's got the photo credits. I've seen this exact tree. It's not. And a tree has a very limited life inside of one of these containers. It's usually 6 to 9 months, and you either need to have it planned to ship or shift into a different sized box. What happens if you don't? It results in girdling roots. The roots hit the side of the pot and they swirl. And if it's too far gone, then there's really not much you can do for it. You should just throw the tree away and not bother planting it. But if this is what occurs, the roots will grow. Eventually, it'll just suffocate itself and die once these roots get large enough to just strangle it off. This is very typical. When you see trees that have been in the ground for quite a while just blow over, it's because the roots were circling and they weren't growing in this direction. So they've got no anchor. Some more of my personal favorite installation technique no-nos. When you do plant a tree that has one of these baskets, you need to cut it off. Or else, and you don't have to cut the entire thing off, you want to just cut the top 6 to 12 inches. And that's an industry standard that everybody should already know if you're in this business. Or else you get this, and you eventually get the girdle via metal basket. Everybody's seen these before, I imagine. These are tree grates. They're really expensive. This is really thick metal. And the idea, the whole concept here is these look nice and fancy, and you plant your little tree and it's got room to grow, and nobody can step in this hole and fall and twist their ankle. But you're supposed to cut these concentric circles out as the tree grows. 0% of the population does this, it seems. So what you end up with is eventually you just have to replace all these trees. And in my neighborhood, they had Alay elms, I'd say 50 or 60, that had this exact situation. They cut the trees when they died, and now they have a pot sitting on here with some kind of cactus or something. This is probably even more common. This is the staking above ground with the little. This is here to protect the tree. You can see how well it's done. You still have to come and take these off after typically one growing season's enough. So I hate seeing this. Location. You can see, you can get the other parts right, and if you put the tree in a bad position, you're probably going to have a bad result. Some things to consider are where are you going to plant the tree? Is it going to be just in a lawn situation with nothing happening underneath? Is it going to be on structure? The 9/11 memorial was on the roof of the plaza, so it's completely elevated and it's suspended in planting pits that run the full course. They built structures to support those planting pits. So rooftop plantings, anything that's not over a solid, that's something to be considered. Planting pits themselves are what you see in parking lots in parking lots, just cutouts in the paving and you plop trees in the ground. There are certain rules to follow when you do that. Planting pits are hardscape boxes that have drains in them. Cutouts are what I was referring to. Excuse me, I said that wrong. But planting pits are they're very common in commercial applications, and they give a lot of challenges because eventually the tree is going to run out of soil to root out into. And the question is, what's the mature height, the mature size of the tree? Have you given it enough soil volume to grow and live to be 30 or 40 years? Oftentimes when people are designing projects, they don't space the trees out enough for their mature size, and you end up with crowding. Sometimes that's done on purpose, knowing that they're going to come out and either transplant every other tree or just remove them. But I always hate to see that. When you do an installation, you'd like to see them plan for the mature size of the tree. Proximity to structures, another thing. You see it all the time where trees get installed, along buildings, and they fight with the building for their remaining existence until they get removed. Planting utilities, these trees have very wide, you'd be surprised at just how wide, and I have a slide that shows what it really looks like under the ground, but the roots go much farther than you might imagine if you haven't seen a whole lot of excavation. So planning that utility work correctly and running those, and again, it's all about protecting the tree from future utility work, with as it pertains to setting up and designing utility easements. I already said a little something about the adequate soil volume. Trees need a lot of soil. James Urban says some really, really high number of soil volume that I don't know if I've ever seen a single tree that has maybe it's 1,500 cubic feet. It's a lot per tree. But the more you can get, the better. That's the bottom line. The happier the soil, the happier the tree, but it has to drain. We've already talked about that. You'd be surprised, these things are a big issue. Reflected light coming off of buildings, glass buildings in big cities. I've seen whole, streets of trees damaged and some die because of this. So they'll do light studies, shadow studies as well to make sure that trees will have enough sun to actually perform well. It's not unusual on a city street with skyscrapers to have trees that just never grow at all because there's maybe an hour of sunlight during a day. And the last one, obviously, is if it's going to be in a windy spot, you probably need to do subsurface root ball anchoring to account for that, or at least pick trees that don't have huge, heavy tops, sails effectively, or that are brittle branching. Okay, so this is a good picture, and this is where how to get the spot right. So you can see, I don't think they've had this one figured out. This is another one. I think I like this one better. So these are the cutouts for the trees. These were where they were supposed to go, and they. I would bet, and I don't know where these trees were planted, but I would guess that this was probably a low bid public project, if I had to guess. So I'm going to talk now about what to do after you've planted the tree and maybe you didn't get it right. We're going to talk about moving trees, which is something that is near and dear to me. When you're talking about tree sizes and trying to figure out what size root balls and equipment that you need to move trees successfully, a general rule of thumb is 10 times it's actually, we measure down here, a foot off the ground. If you measure the diameter of this trunk and multiply by 10, that tells you how many inches of a root ball you need. Arborists who go out and do tree surveying and whatnot, they take these measurements at 4.5 feet because they don't want to bend over because they do it 1,000 times in a day. So we don't want this number because it's significantly different a lot of times than what this one is. Why so shallow? A lot of people, when I show you these videos and images in a little while. You're going to look at it and say, wow, it looks like a birthday cake. I would have thought it would have been so much deeper. Like I mentioned before, you really only need 18 to 24 inches of this soil. You capture that, that's where all the magic happens that keeps the tree alive. What's really important is this distance here, this radius. Capture as much of this biomass as possible. So how do trees get moved typically? Conventional tree spades, I don't know how long they've been in existence, probably 40 years, I'm guessing. These are available in the industry. They're mounted either on trucks that you see running up and down the street. They were actually invented here in Texas. And they have flexible mounting options depending on site conditions, or in tree farms you'll see construction equipment rather than street trucks for running up and down the highways. But these are available starting really small at 36-inch diameter, all the way up to 105-inch, I think is the largest commercially available. Environmental Design actually has patents on two large machines. One is it digs a 10-foot diameter hole, 120 inches diameter, and that actually runs up and down the streets. It has a tilting mechanism that allows you to tilt the tree so you can get under overpasses and utilities. I don't have a picture of that one. This one here is actually the larger, older brother, the 168-inch. This is the largest tree spade in existence. Environmental Design also has exclusivity on these machines. They haven't sold any. They run these machines up and down all around the international scale. They go from project to project. Here's a quick video clip so you can get a feel for the scale. This is a traffic stopper. If you see this machine, it's 30 feet wide from here, from this tire to this tire. It digs a 14-foot diameter hole, and that root ball with the tree in it weighs approximately 75,000 pounds, give or take. Depends on the soil condition. And as I was telling Dr. Creech before, these blades are independently hydraulically driven, as you can see, and they will find any and every utility known to man and do some serious damage to it. It's wonderful on demolition sites. If it's a demo of an old strip mall, or golf courses are fantastic. It moves trees only in the vertical position, so you're limited to moving the trees on property. You can't go running down the highway because it can't tilt. If there are any, you have to take power lines down and avoid bridges and that kind of thing.
Who makes these kind of machines?
Pardon?
Who makes this equipment? Is that made in the United States, or is it?
This one was actually, the guy who's riding this machine here, he's not supposed to be doing that, but he built these machines. These were purpose-built by an engineer, and he's actually working on a larger machine that has, it's made several improvements. As you can see, the hydraulic spades, they dig pretty darn deep, and that has to do with the design on the blades and how much force they could take and the torque that goes on trying to get them to cut this direction. So improving those angles is the key. I think I can make this. Tree boxing is not only another kind of container, if you will. So trees are grown in boxes and sold just like containers, plastic containers are. Generally, you'll pay about 25% more for a wooden box tree than an equivalently sized plastic container tree. And I mean that based on the soil volume contained in the container. It's a merchandising thing. They look like they're worth more. It is more expensive, I would say. It is more expensive for the box itself than the container, so that's part of it. But it just looks like a better product, and it's definitely superior for transportation down the highway. They can take vibrations better. In addition to growing trees in boxes, transplanting occurs. You can go out and actually harvest a tree that's in the ground, shape it. And this soil, this is beautiful, great soil, loamy soil for doing this. If you tried this in sandier soil, obviously it just falls and slides down. So you have to actually be placing the box in as you excavate if you're working in sandier soils, but it is possible.
When they plant a box tree, how do they get it out of the box?
They plant the bottom and take the sides off. So the bottom will eventually rot. And so you set it, and that's usually about 4 to 6 inches. So you'll set it, it'll set high for a little while while the box bottom rots. It's a very, it's a science and an art trying to get those bottom boards on. It can be unsafe depending on the planting, the soils that you're dealing with. Sandier soils are just a little bit tough to manage. Now, there's conditioning. You can add things to the soil and manage the water just right to where it congeals a little bit. But that's, again, that's an art as much of a science. So this tree was box harvested, and this is about as large of a box tree as you'll ever see. I think this was probably 18 feet across, give or take. Every tree on this project was boxed or moved with tree spades at least twice. All of the trees that are on the Wynn Golf Course were transplanted out. The shaping of the course occurred, and then the trees came back, and I think it was between 2,000 and 3,000 total trees. And that's what so you can see this is a large crane. This is probably a 250-ton crane. This is a really cool system. Environmental Design patented this system, and they use airbags, they're balloons, sausages, and you'll see this in a minute, to actually hoist the trees and to transport the trees on. And in large tree transplanting, the big items, the big ticket cost items are cranes for the most part. And as the larger these trees get, the root balls get heavy, the cranes get astronomical, and in a lot of cases that would make it cost prohibitive. So there's always this fight to how can you do this without cranes. One option was using these heavy haul transporters, but they're extremely expensive as well. These are what gets used to move the space shuttle around and all sorts of other extremely heavy loads. This tree used to be one of the coolest projects. This was Lance Armstrong's tree, back when it was a really good thing to be Lance Armstrong. And this was, he bought this property adjacent to his place for this tree, moved it in front of his house, and built his driveway and everything around. It's phenomenal looking. So here's that process of getting this tree encapsulated this way and ready for transplant. Root pruning is probably the most important thing. You go in and you sever the roots to a depth of about 2, maybe 3 feet, depending on what you find when you're digging. Again, this root ball size is, you can estimate 10 to 1, the size of the trunk. Certain soil conditions may let you cheat a little bit or not. Certain species just are known to transplant better than others. So that all kind of comes into play, as well as what's happening around here. Where are the utilities that we need? Sometimes you'll have an asymmetric root ball because there's a utility coming through here that can't be, fiber optic cable that'll cost $300,000 to move over. So you'll take a chance and cut the root ball on one side. Any questions?
So to put water in this thing after they replace water?
Oh yeah, you'll once you cut these roots.
You have to leave them for a while, huh?
The more time between cutting the roots and when you transplant the tree, the better. And the ideal case is a year. And if you have a whole lot of money and a whole lot of time, you can come in and you can actually skip a spot, like a pie, where you skip every other piece of pie and do a partial root prune. Then you come back and hit the rest of it later, and then you come back and actually hoist it out of the ground. It just allows the tree to partially shock, recover, generate new roots, and it's very important. If you're not going to have time to root prune when you're moving trees this size, you just make the root system larger to accommodate for that additional root loss. But once you cut these roots, this tree is going to need supplemental water starting then. I only show this because I just told you that these root balls don't need to be deep, and then this one's 10 feet. But this guy had a whole lot of money, and he decided it was going to be 10 feet deep every time, so they were 10 feet deep. You can see, I show this picture because of the scale. You can really see how large this is. I think this weighed over 1 million pounds, this load.
It looks like you cut down a lot of trees. Is that one thing?
No, absolutely. This was upstate New York. This crazy. There's only been maybe 2 or 3 projects this scale where this guy just moved trees around and built mountainsides the way he wanted to. And he would take trees like this and move them 7 or 8 times. And the last time it would be like right here, kind of right back where it started. It was kind of wild.
How did you do something that large?
Back then, you can see on this photo here, this was before we had the airbags. They had the airbags. They used these gantry lift systems that are these hydraulic jacks. So they actually rig, there are beams underneath the root ball, and then there are beams above it, and they're attached with slings. So they just hydraulically lift and then back some sort of transporter underneath. Very technical process. So here's a more normal. This is probably a 36-inch, 3-foot diameter live oak big tree. And this is probably, do the math, 26, 27 foot diameter, about 3.5 foot deep. This is when you get to this stage of it, it's been root pruned. They're clearing it out to insert the lifting grillage, which you'll see in the next photo. But this is a really clean, good shot of it. They're not all round. This was the primate exhibit at the San Diego Zoo. Quite the project. This is a large ficus, and ficus move like weeds. Really simple. So that's why this, looks like a pretty small root ball relative to the trunks. It's because they can take it. They're tropical. Anything with a milky sap tends to move really well. So once you get this encapsulated, you push pipe underneath it, and this pipe is sized and spaced. There's engineering involved to make sure that that the lift will be successful. What you're trying to do is lift this root ball without having any deflection. You don't want to crack the root ball. That generally will result in a failed transplant. Those are metal pipes. These are rejected or used drill stem. And you use this is a jack. This is a hammer that's used to break concrete, and we build an interface between this pipe and this hammer to push the pipe beneath the tree. It's brilliant. I didn't think of it, so I can say that. This is a cool video that I'll get a drink of water and let y'all watch. And there's some bad music that goes along with it. So this has already been encapsulated. The pipes have been pounded underneath, and then they're tied together with these beams. So what arbor lift really is utilizing these bladders, these pneumatic bladders. You pull them underneath and you lift, and these are at amazingly low pressure, 15 psi, and the lifting capacity is determined by the surface area of contact between the bladders and the root ball. So we've yet to come across a lift. I mean, it's not unlimited, but we've yet to find a project that it couldn't, that exceeded the lifting capacity. You just buy bigger bags. Yeah, just like the Egyptians did it, right? Just rolling it on logs. And these are the fastest workers that we have. But before this technology, this tree would have had to have been picked up by a crane, set on some sort of trailer, moved. The crane has to move over. If it rains, it's a big problem because you've got the crane. It's a rental. I mean, and it's there by the hour, and all the trucks for the counterweights that go along with it. So it's just, this really took a lot of the risk out. Another really nice thing about this is you can set it down, come out and pick it up the next day and move it over 3 feet, and it's not a real big effort to do that. If the architect doesn't like the direction it's facing, you can do that. Before this, you'd have to call a crane company to come back and start talking about additional dollars for the project. I've seen this. The longest move I've seen is probably 1.5 miles, and this, with a tree this size and the ground, you know, the conditions, the site conditions mean everything. But they'll get, you know, a 1/2 mile in a day on a good day. And the one other nice thing about this, it can work under wet conditions. If you try doing anything, I mean, this tree right here probably weighs 150,000 pounds. If you're trying to do anything in mud that's not suspended on air, good luck. You're going to bury your equipment. Good question. I would tell you that environmental design's historic success rate is above 95%, and the larger trees are the highest success rates because of the cost involved. The aftercare is what generally, if you do everything else right and the aftercare is wrong, you're going to lose some trees. Some species are forgiving. Live oak's a great tree for that. I was talking to someone earlier who was asking about post oaks, and they are the least forgiving tree that I've ever dealt with. When I was with environmental design, there were several clients that wanted to move post oaks, and you tell them it has 50% chance at best. And some folks wanted to do it anyway. And these are all just, I don't really know why that is. I don't think anybody does because they can't tell you, but just certain species move better. Pecan trees do actually have a significantly sized taproot, and they do not like being moved when they have leaves on them. So if you're planting or buying pecan trees, it's always best to do it when it's dormant. Bur oaks are the same way, not quite as sensitive, but that's been my experience. And
Who owns the dead tree that dies? Does the environmental design replace that tree?
Industry standard, so large trees get supplied and installed for projects, and in some cases it's transplanted from another property, but to the client who's buying the tree, they are purchasing a tree, and that always comes with a warranty. Sometimes if you're moving a 200-year-old oak from one side of a property to another, like the Lance Armstrong tree, there's no other tree. So in some cases, there's just no warranty, and that's kind of what the contract says. Or you may offer a replacement warranty with other trees that would be brought in. It varies from job to job. But if there's no other way to get a tree, to a property, there's not much you can do. You just do your best to make sure that it survives. But again, the larger trees generally have the highest success rates, and it's not even close because there's a whole lot of investment.
So what did it cost to move that tree?
This one, the one in the video,
Yeah.
if I had to guess, projects like that, when you get out there and you move one tree, you have the whole mobilization cost,
Yeah.
especially if you had to travel and go do the work in Omaha, Nebraska, or wherever. I think on this job there may have been 7 or 8 trees, and they probably spent $25,000 each on those. But you build a project around it, a development around it, and it looks like the trees have been there for.
That sounds cheap.
Yeah.
That's what I've been saying for 15 years. It's just not enough, But I think the most expensive tree that I can recall that I was involved with was $350,000, and we moved it. It was 80 inches in diameter, and we moved it 1.5 miles down the road in Louisiana, which I never thought would have happened. But
You moved it down the highway?
moved it down the highway. They took down, and we were working for the Department of Transportation, so the idea of stopping traffic, they like doing that. It's no problem. So they had to drop 4 power lines in front of us for us as we drove by. Now we didn't do that on the airbags. We used one of those heavy haul transporters because of the distance and the timing, because it really was this We got that 1.5 miles done in probably 45 minutes. It was.
Survive?
It did, and in fact, it's much happier in its new home than where it was before. I mean, the level of care. I mean, they drilled a well and have irrigation, and it's maintained well.
You give them a year guarantee, or I mean,
Industry standard for a supplied tree, if you know, a contractor comes and installs trees on this site or anywhere else, they're going to give you a 1-year limited warranty. It basically says, I'm not going to replace this if you forgot to water it for 6 months or if you ran over it with a car. But short of that, they'll come and replace it 1 year. Additional warranty is negotiated. Sometimes with really nice trees, they'll want some additional warranty. My experience and my recommendations have always been, if it's going to die, and if it's a transplant and it's going to die from root loss, it's going to happen in that first year anyway. That first summer is going to be, you know, the test.
buy a maintenance contract with you?
No, not always. When we're in the area, yes, but you know, these projects occurred all over the world. So what would normally happen, we'd seek out the best arborist, you know, local arborist who understands water and everything else about that environment, you know, that regional area, and we'll have them contracted outside of ours, or sometimes as a subcontract for the maintenance during the warranty period, whether it's 1, 2, or 3 years. That's unusual, though. And again, that happens on trees that have a name, or, you know, if you're spending a couple $100,000 to move it, it's smart to spend 20 more to make sure it stays alive. Because what happens is the water gets turned off. It's 4th of July. Everybody's popping fireworks and having beers, and you show up on July 8th and it's toast. So it's nice, if you can, to have somebody out there making sure that water stays on.
Yeah, because if it was privately maintained, how would you know if they didn't take care of it? Or, I mean, you know, how would you know that, well, you would obviously know that it was damaged, or, well, I don't know. Would
Believe
you know
me.
that somebody been driving over it, or what
There's-
water?
There's a lot of forensic evidence, and people know what to look for. I mean, the way that the tree dies, and there's a whole lot of finger pointing if it's an expensive tree all of a sudden. You know, a lot of times what happens is you plant the tree, it's happy, it's great, you go away, and they forgot that they needed to put electric to get Christmas lights in the tree later that year, so they'll walk behind you and put a trench in the root ball 1 foot deep right up to the trunk, you know, because the contractor didn't know any better and there was no one supervising that trade. So they ruined $250,000 worth of supplied trees, and the contractor looks at it and says, not mine, you know. So most of these contracts have clauses in them, you know, damages contracts for their other trades, saying if you come near it, if you look at a tree wrong, you know, we're going to kill you. That's the full show that I brought for you guys, the presentation. If you have any other questions, there's no bad questions.
All your projects, like large projects, doing like parks or zoos, or do you do more individual, 1 or 2 or 3 trees, or?
It's a mix. There's lots of private residential work. Sometimes it's, you know, just one tree in the yard that they lost a big tree and they want to bring one in. They're buying time, you know. It takes a long time for a tree to grow to be a big, beautiful, and if you got enough money to do it, you don't have to wait. But there's not enough steady residential work. I don't think if that was all you did, you'd have a hard time. The largest projects are typically going to be commercial.
So if they're planning, like, say, a park, a large park in a town, say, like downtown Manhattan, or whatever, do you design like trees and everything there, or does somebody else do this and you just handle the trees alone?
The more involvement we have in the design process, it's better for the project in our mind, you know, because the landscape architects that they recognize that they can't be experts in everything all the time, or they may not have all of that expertise in-house. So they'll go to contractors that they have, you know, good experience and trust with and get some advice. We call that design assist. So whenever we can do it, it's very, very desirable to do so, because when you get involved, your chances of being involved on the project itself, significantly increase. So I hope I answered your question.
Pines have a large taproot, and you actually move the pine trees,
Yeah, pines are pretty easy, and they grow so fast, and they're kind of a dime a dozen, so nobody really invests in moving really giant pines. But I think there's, in the Houston market, for instance, you can buy 4 to 6 inch pine trees that are maybe 12 to 16 feet tall for less than $1,000 installed. And they do have a taproot that you have, and you'll see folks that harvest pecan trees, and sometimes you'll see them on pines, not as often. They have a special hook on the back, a blade on the bottom, on one of those spade blades that actually sever that taproot, but it's more common on pecan trees. You had a question?
No, that was what
Oh, really? Okay. Okay. Yeah, but pines are generally really, it's commoditized kind of, you have shade like oak trees, and then pines are generally about a third less expensive, at least.
that pine tree was, right away, full shell, was over 100 years old. The root went down, probably 6 feet.
Did it?
They cut a major limb off, and the pine tree was down into it and killed the tree. It's really strange.
Yeah, I've got tons of pines in they're just destroying my driveway and probably my foundation as we speak.
The driveway through Michigan.
Oh, yeah.
They don't hear anything about the trees.
Exactly right.
After y'all plant your trees, do y'all make a mulch bed around the trees?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And generally, so the size of the root ball, that's the area that has the roots in it now, and right outside of it, so you want to encourage. But we'll fill that with not more than 3 inches of mulch, and you don't want your mulch to be right up against the trunk of the tree, because it can cause root rot. You just want to keep it nice and dry at the base, and just add it once a year.
I'm going to, we actually move on a key, pull up on another property that he owns, took it out to one of our places. And what I done, I put a Miracle product with paint underneath, on the bottom of it, and around it, with the dark cover.
And how
That same year, it bloomed 3 times.
Oh, that's amazing.
And then I transferred last year, in the wintertime, to another place, and it's still doing great.
Well, once you cut the roots, if it doesn't kill it, then its chances of surviving it again are fantastic. And that's the whole concept of the root prune. You kind of hurt it a little, but not as much as if you just uprooted it. And you're insulting the tree a little bit at a time. So that second move, I'm not surprised that it would do. And I keep trying to tell. It's in certain soil conditions and climates, trees just perform better and they transplant easier. In Florida, in South Florida, they'll go out and they'll put the machine blades down on a tree every year, once a year, cut the roots, and then it grows new roots, fibrous roots, and then they cut them again, and they cut them again. So you can end up with an 17 or 18 inch diameter oak tree with a root ball that's only, instead of 10 to 1, it may be 6 to 1 by doing that. Try that in Texas and tell me how it goes, but in Florida it works. Any other questions?
I got one for you. I go to auctions all over, and over in Garrison, I bought, you go to the fruit trees, but they were in bags,
Grow bags.
but I guess they pulled them up, but they have wet sawdust all wrapped around the roots.
Those were bare root
Yeah, that's another technique where they'll use an air spade to knock the soil away, and they'll put it in a media or with something, and then when they plant it, that's good. Certain varieties of trees just are known to be tougher and can take it better, and if you have good techniques and get the science right, you can have real good success.
This is the company that bought 200 trees out here on Science Research Center, and they average 6.5 inches and 30 feet tall. And when I showed Jonathan this after a while about Judice, he said, I want to buy them. And I said, why? Because I think 30 foot tall, 6.5. How many on a tractor trailer? Seven on a tractor trailer. And they had good, I thought it was pretty risky on your part. It was kind of an unknown tree, but they moved well and they.
Yeah, no, they're actually phenomenal in terms of their resilience. We put them on some job sites in some terrible soil-like stuff. I mean, it was like Mars. Those were 70-inch. They were Acer scoochi, the Mexican mountain maple, and they are a cool tree that I have a lot of interest in, and I'm excited about its potential. We don't have a lot of maples that do well in the state of Texas, particularly if you get into the hill country or Dallas-Fort Worth, West Texas. This plant can take high alkalinity, both soil and water, drought very well, because we tried to kill it, not on purpose, but we tried, and we didn't. Next question?
Did you store them for a while before you sold them, or?
We actually dug them where they were. So we grabbed the tree with the machine, pulled it up out of the ground in the same hole that it was in. You throw a basket down with burlap lining it, and you drop the tree back in it, and you close it up. And we left those trees there, some of them for over a year, I think. And then we yanked them out of the ground.
A loop irrigation system.
Yeah, they were irrigated out here, and Dr. Creech was praying for them.
I'm not sure whose prayers count.
They have little notes on the tags, and he sends them messages. He knows where they all are.
It's an amazing project because of the university and the difficulties of dealing with that much money. And basically what was an inspiration, it was brilliant. We turned it into a research project. And we have them in Zone 7 up near Fort Worth, which is a little colder, and then we have them down in Houston, and then we have them here. So it's in Zone 7, 8, 9. It's a genotype environment study. We're trying to do research. Really, I wanted the money. We have to feed staff here. Well, they hold them all the way up into late December or January. They're not evergreen. They're not.
But they're.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, there's so few of them. We have a good number of them in the Arboretum.
But they're showy. They have really nice fall color, but they won't start producing fall color until they start producing seeds. So that whole big test plot that he had was really young. They haven't produced seed yet. We're hoping that because we stressed them out by cutting the roots and torturing them, that may encourage them to produce seed faster.
Or girdle.
So are they in the ground yet?
They are. I have I don't know, 75 of them that are in the ground that were the least desirable, at least aesthetically. I wanted them for the genetics. So we'd have a source for seed, and we can start playing with those. The other ones are going to various projects, the Houston Botanical Garden. They're going to be on, I don't know, a dozen or more sites with decent numbers here pretty soon.
So is the survival rate the same in the different zones, or are you
Well, the toughest condition, we brought 20 of them there in August, stuck them in the ground, forgot to water them for a week, and I drove up, and every single one of them had brown curled leaves on them, and I was about to have a fit, and every single one of those trees came back. So, and the soil, it's just a tough spot. So there's no other site that's comparable that we've sent them to. So that's kind of the worst case. So I'm excited about their commercial viability, and there's just not a lot of maples that you can do that. There's none that you can do that with in the state of Texas. There are a lot hardy maples that are good they just can't take the summer. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you, Jonathan.